Thank you so much for organising, and thank you everyone who's come tonight. I think it is really powerful as the Green Party members, supporters, that at a time when we are physically apart, that we can come together, and so important that we're coming together on big questions and big ideas. I feel like people are looking at the solutions in a much more pragmatic way than people have done previously. And I think that tackling issues around austerity, when we possibly have another recession on the horizon with a double impact of a possibility of a no-deal Brexit coming this winter. So let's begin with what really is austerity. Austerity has been plaguing this country. Plaguing is probably not a good word to use at this time, but plaguing this country since 2010, where the coalition government decided that their budgets weren't going to have communities at the heart of them, weren't going to have people, our schools, our public services, the very things that we need to have delivered to support our members of our communities in a variety of different ways. Instead, they put forward a budget that analysed the UK economy as if it was as simple as managing a household income. Now, I manage my budget, and if there's not enough money, then maybe I do cut back on certain things. Maybe I don't get the most expensive, the kind of nicest things when I'm at the supermarket. Maybe I don't go to the pub. But compare that to the government, who have got tax-raising powers that enables them to charge taxes to the richest in society, meaning that we're able to address issues around inequality. Applying this mentality to something as complex as a national budget is simply short-sighted. To do it during a time of recession, a time when all economists have shown that what we need to do at that time is invest. We saw what happened in the Depression in America, when Roosevelt put together the New Deal, which we'll come to again later, that had genuine investment in workers, in people, in what the future of America could look like, and built their way out of a recession, supporting lives and jobs in the process. What we've seen here in the UK is those cuts tear apart the very fabric of our communities, how our basic systems had operated, how we need to make sure that we are supporting the lives of so many. Cuts to services such as rape crisis centres, domestic violence services, youth services, our NHS, our schools. We've seen that people with disabilities who have been directly attacked by the changes in systems that have forced them back to work when they should never have been put in that situation. This has been an attack on so many, and so many people are living with the consequences. I must admit that my perspective of this comes from as a younger person who I had recently graduated when the recession started, and it meant that there were no jobs. It was very hard to get into work. It was, you could see the queues outside the job centre of people who'd been made recently redundant, as I had myself. But we also saw a rise of things like zero-hour contracts. These contracts that stripped away the rights people fought and died for, such as sick pay and maternity pay and holiday leave. Really basic rights that has changed the well-being of our relationship to work and our workers. And this stripping away became normalised. Some people said that the government had a deficit fetish, saying that the deficit was all that they could talk about, when actually what we see is in times of crisis, you don't talk about the deficit, you invest in the country, you support people. And we're seeing that with coronavirus in many ways, that we didn't just leave, whatever I think of the failures of this Conservative government, it didn't start from a starting point that people were just going to be left behind and failed by a system. There were areas of support with the furlough scheme. Obviously, a universal basic income would have been better and would have made sure that so many people didn't slip through the net, whether that was new workers or other staff. But the impacts have been severe. We've seen a ricochet effect through the decade. I think that looking at the effects that it has on a generation, but also on wider communities, has been incredible. I've been deputy leader now for 6 years, and I've been to so many different communities across the country and heard what so many people's stories are about the impacts in their area. As you can imagine, I'm sure if you've canvassed, you've had this as well. Many people say, oh, I'm not that interested in politics. But then we'll suddenly be like, but I'm really angry that my community centre has shut down. A space that we were able to come together, whether it was for kids' birthday parties or whether it was for aerobics or something that sounds less 80s than aerobics, but all of these different things that you bring together, but also where people could organise. And when I go to different estates, different housing estates that are being demolished or people are basically being thrown out of their homes, I find it incredibly fascinating that it's often those that have been built with community centres at their heart that are more likely to survive. Because when there's a moment where they need to meet, where they need to come together, they have a space to go and do that. And I think it just shows the strength of such basic things in our communities that gives strength to other aspects of it and builds our society as a whole. We saw youth services completely demolished. Councils, and let's be clear about the impacts of austerity. So if you look at a council today, it will have less money to spend tomorrow than it did 10 years ago, where we should be seeing an increased investment in so many areas. What we've seen is a stripping away of services that has closed so many of these basic places and hasn't been reversed. You'll hear the Conservative Party saying that austerity is over, while also delivering budgets that aren't about investment in communities at its heart. And if you look at youth services, I think that people said that we were alarmist when we said that what's the impact of cutting youth services is more crime on our streets. Young people not having as many options and as much support. Young people failed by a system, and then effectively when crime is increased, it's the young people themselves that are blamed rather than a system that abandoned them at a young age or potentially throughout their lives. We saw a bedroom tax that meant that poor people who had spare rooms were having to pay an additional tax with so little money that they had anyway. It's just essentially lacks principles and is completely, the words I want to use are just how unimaginable it must be to be making policy decisions that harms the parts of our society in this way. It's short-sighted, and it just shows a complete lack of understanding of what the makeup of our communities are. I feel like when I worked at Grenfell Tower and a few days after the fire happened, I worked with some of the members of the community there, not the people who'd been in the tower themselves, but the people who'd witnessed it and experienced severe impacts of seeing a disaster that they should never have seen, seeing their friends and families in a building that was burning down. And what was interesting there was how their community has been chipped away at time and time again. The closing of libraries, the closing of community centres, the closing of youth services, even after the events, cuts to mental health services, even after the event, things like the local community services being shut down. Even after the event, as we know, universal basic income takes about 6 weeks to process. 3 weeks before Christmas, it was introduced to the Grenfell community. It's the heartlessness of these policies show just an absolute lack of understanding of how our communities work and what we need to boost and bolster them, to make sure that we have resilient communities at a time of crisis, but resilient communities that gives opportunities to everyone. And those opportunities have been cut for so many. If we look at schools at the moment, we see how they've been harmed. Over 7,000 head teachers have been in touch with the government to say that the cuts are directly impacting the education of children. We hear of teachers who have put washing machines in their spare rooms so that they're able to wash the uniforms of school children whose families aren't able to afford, effectively experiencing fuel poverty and not able to, having to choose between heating their homes and putting food on their table. And things like putting on the washing machine is a financial choice that means that they're not able to do it on every occasion, harming children in the process. And I think today is an interesting day to be speaking about this. We know that holiday hunger impacts children every single time the holidays come round. I've been to Huddersfield and seen Huddersfield FC actually putting on food for children who would go hungry if they weren't there to provide the basics. And it's children who are also being failed when places in Manchester have to close early on a Friday because they simply can't afford to pay the teachers for a full, for Monday to Friday for the full teaching hours. A half day which was in the news at the same time as the youth strikes were. And while the government was saying that young people should be at school and not at the youth strikes, failed to see that there were many schools experiencing closures as a result of a lack of funding from the government itself. And part of this system isn't just about saying that there's not enough money. It's about using this ideology to then sell off many of our vital services to private companies. Again, when you look at Roosevelt and the Green New Deal, the beginning of it was basically saying that the greedy, feckless financial sector was the problem when it came to the Depression. And as we saw from the recession, it was a complete echo of that scenario. But when we see these what we saw in this country was, instead of turning away from the Virgins of this world and the big businesses, we saw the sale of basic services to these companies. I was at Bath just a few years ago, where our councillor there was standing against the privatisation of different services in their communities to Virgin. Now, Virgin tried to sue her and said if she voted in that vote, because they knew that she'd signed a petition saying keep the NHS public, that they were going to sue her for essentially a conflict of interest, as if values and principles are somehow a conflict of interest when they're the very values and principles that this democracy elected our Green councillor on. She went into that chamber, she voted for against these Virgin Care taking over their local services. They didn't sue her, but she didn't win, because we've seen councils across the country essentially fail when it comes to protecting so many different parts of our services. And that's the failure of the disappointment that I feel when you see Labour councillors effectively pandering to this belief that somehow cuts are beneficial to communities and giving services to big corporations rather than potentially kind of local groups that come together to make sure that we're able to deliver in our community without lining the pockets of a sector that is purely there to promote money for their shareholders, not for the benefit of our communities alone. And we see it in the NHS quite clearly with the backdoor privatisation that's happened. People always talk about the NHS free at the point of service, and I don't think that's a big enough ambition for the NHS. The NHS has to be purely in public hands. We can't see the ongoing backdoor privatisation that we've seen put in place. In 2015, we did a video on the NHS as the Green Party in the run-up to the election, and it was something like, I'm not an evil genius, but if I was, this is how I'd privatise the NHS. And it basically shows how you gradually privatise different sections of it, as we've seen cleaning going to G4S, and we've seen the ambulance services being sold off. I've spoken to people, ambulance drivers in North Wales, who despair as they aren't able to get their patients into their hospitals as a result of a failure of delivery from a G4S process that just simply wasn't working, a process that had been working before but no longer does, putting patients in dire circumstances. And when we think about these points, I think that so many people don't realise what's happening behind closed doors, how these things have been privatised. The NHS, something that we don't always realise how much it's being damaged by government policy until we're in our hour of need. I often talk about resilience in many different formats, whether it's the work that I've been doing on flooding or whether it's about how we invest in public services. We know that the NHS struggles every year as a result of winter flu. We know that the winter is such a tough time for it. Yes, yet many of the policies put in place seem to ignore the effects that something like winter flu has. There wasn't the investment for something like a global pandemic. Now, working on the government, looking at the government's resilience documents on risk and resilience, which I do often look across, their own data shows that a global pandemic, admittedly they were expecting flu, but when it comes to PPE and investment in our NHS, I don't think that makes a difference. It was as likely that we were expecting a pandemic in this country. It was as likely as we were to experience a winter snowstorm that would disrupt the country. Now, as a risk, and knowing that what would mitigate against that risk was genuine investment in people, in nurses, in doctors, in paying a fair wage to cleaning services, in making sure that our NHS was resilient, not trying to sell it off to the highest bidder through a backdoor privatisation project that weakened the NHS as a whole. The ideology that this Conservative government has doesn't work for us. It works for the 1%. That's what austerity is. And as they say, austerity is over. We know it's not, because we know that in our communities, when we look around, that people aren't benefiting from policies in our communities. They're seeing their libraries shut down. They're seeing their friends and families struggling. As I said, having to choose between putting food on their table and heating their homes. Having to, even some people needing to make that decision when they have insulin in their fridges. Unfortunately, that person decided that they weren't able to pay their energy bills and as a result died because they couldn't chill their own insulin. We're the sixth richest nation in the world. I don't think it's a big statement to say that we can do better. And this virus has dismantled the old. When people talk about going back to normal, I think a lot of us can say, what the hell was normal about before? What the hell was normal about children living in poverty? What the hell was normal about people sleeping rough on our streets? What the hell was normal about not genuinely investing in tackling one of the biggest risks to the country and world of the climate crisis? Now, we need to invest. Actually, borrowing's quite low at the moment, so it's a great time to borrow and invest in this country. We talked about Roosevelt's New Deal, and many people will argue about where the idea of the Green New Deal comes from. People in the UK will say it was Anne Pettifor and Caroline Lucas, Andrew Sims, and the people who came together with the original Green New Deal group at the beginning of the last economic crisis, saying that what you need to do is invest in the country to stop a recession, as economists have been saying. But what we need to do is invest in green sectors, have an army of people who will be working to reduce our carbon emissions, while making sure that people are in work and have opportunities for their future. This idea has now caught in America with AOC, and during the arguments when people say, where did it originate? They'll say, in the UK, you just put the word green in front of what originally was our idea. But I think that just shows that these investments work, and what we need to build is an opportunity, not just for our generation, but for generations to come. If you look at architecture, you have to knock down a building before you can build something better. And as we've seen the old systems dismantle with coronavirus, it's exposed how bad our social security truly was. It shows how insufficient our universal credit is. It proves that a universal basic income is a fundamental way to make sure that nobody slips through the cracks by giving a basic payment to every person. It shows that we need to be making sure that we're tackling inequality in our communities, making sure that we are analysing policy through the lens of race and gender, making sure that the rights of disabled people are enshrined in the work that we do. We cannot go back to how we were before. We cannot go back to business as usual. I think that's a bit easier for me to say sat in Wales, because I appreciate that everybody else is. I think that being in England at the moment, it must feel like you're rushing back already. But it's not too late to put those big ideas out there, because as people, we have all changed. We've seen that we can change things overnight. We can home the homeless. We can invest in, although not enough money, but we can invest in trying to tackle domestic violence. We can do these things when we think about the bigger picture. And that's why I've always been proud to be a member of the Green Party, because when we make policy, we're not just thinking about how we get elected in the next 5 years. We look at the kind of world we want to create, and our manifestos are simply the stepping stones to us getting there. I think it means that we've got resilient policies, and it's proved that we need a lot of resilience in this country the last few months. So we need to remember at every chance our own power, because as we sit here, we know that the right are already organising to once again benefit the 1%, benefit big corporations and financial industries, and take away what we need in our communities, in our streets, in our schools, in our hospitals. And we need to be vocal about what we genuinely need, and that's investment in our country, investment in people, having people and planet before profit. We don't need to just have a die on the altar of growth for the sake of growth. We need something that works for people and enhances their well-being, opportunities, and addresses inequality. So don't let people begin to champion austerity for the future. As I said, that double impact of coronavirus and a no-deal Brexit could fundamentally harm our policies going forward. But one thing I will say about Boris Johnson is he likes to do what he thinks might be popular. And the louder we can be and the more minds we can change about what the future looks like, about what we want to build, who we are, how we want to be the architects of that future and create something better than before. He obviously wouldn't do it as good as if there was a Green Prime Minister, but I think that there's a chance that he'll listen. So make sure each of us are working to stop austerity in its tracks if it is mentioned at any point, but by how we make sure that we create a vision for a green future, a Green New Deal that genuinely tackles social justice and puts environmental protection in place while making sure that we stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. I think we need a vision as a country, and we have it. So make sure you're using social media as well as petitioning and using other forms of action to get your voice heard. I hope beyond hope that we don't experience what we experienced in 2010, for young people having opportunities cut, for the intersects between all of those points of how austerity affected women, how it affected young people, disabled people, people of colour, and obviously the intersectional aspects of all of those groups, as well as how it's hurt the working class for such a long time, because they've been ignored time and time again by a government that is blind to what this country, who builds this country, and what makes this country great fundamentally. So remember your own power, don't stay silent, speak out, keep campaigning. Let's build something better than before.
Excellent, thank you so much. I mean, if we do like a Zoom round of applause, it's very difficult, but I don't know, that was, yeah, Like, brilliant, and thank you so much for joining us all our events. It's such a delight to have you, and it's given us an awful lot to think about. I think I've had so many questions flying through that I'm going to try and keep track, but I thought I'd just kick off with like a number of people have come through with questions around like this investment of people that we're speaking about that's so different to what we've seen in the last 10 years, and as you shared alternatives around kind of a vision for a Green New Deal and what that means. We've also had some kind of specific questions about what you might think of other opportunities to bring about new policies that could be much more progressive and changing the course of our future. And one particularly, someone has asked, in parallel to the universal basic income, which you did mention briefly, is should the Green Party be an advocate for universal jobs guarantee, much like civilian conservation corporation during the FDR presidency in the post-1930s? Pranav-gnosis stuff. And then the question is, in order to promote a kind of global community cooperation and solidarity rather than cutthroat capitalist competition.
I think that what's really important at this time as well is having that as a green jobs guarantee. And I think that right now the training opportunities that we should be putting in place to make sure that we are talking about how we are supporting and developing people into work that will be needed in the next few months and years is really vital. We saw in the 1970s how households changed to gas in quite a short period of time as a result of training and a vision that that's what we were going to move our homes to. What we could be doing during this period is be talking about insulation and warm homes, which would help communities in terms of people not spending as much money on energy, but also provide jobs for after the well, I don't think we're going to have an after coronavirus for a long time, but while we're living with coronavirus, there are green jobs that we can be creating. And the trade unions came together with the vision of 1 million green jobs. And this is from everything, whether it's kind of renewables or engineering to warm homes. I think it's really important that we also have a feminist lens to that as well, and talk about the role of care and other parts of our work that makes our community stronger. And so I think it's a good point. I think that it should be a green angle on it, because I look at where I am in Newport and I find it interesting that people are looking at green jobs because they look at what they're working at the moment and they don't feel secure and they don't feel future-proofed. And I know, being in jobs not in the same frame, but after the recession, there was a trend that you just get short-term contracts after short-term contracts after short-term contracts, because I was working in the charity sector, weren't able to take the risk on employment. And I remember the incredible strain that had on what that meant for my housing, what that meant for paying the bills, what that meant in terms of feeling so drastically insecure. And I think that there's a point at the moment where, talking to some people in these industries, I can see that reflected in what they're saying as well, that they don't know what the future looks like, because they know that their work probably isn't going to exist in a year, 2 years, 5 years, whenever it's going to come. And I think that we should be providing green job opportunities that genuinely are about how we providing training and opportunities into industries that are about the future, not about a vision of the past.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Fantastic. You can still send your questions through to us just by sending me a private message, although I'm trying to get through them, but I'm sure that I'm missing some as well. But you can still do that whilst we're talking, just to let you know. But we have another question, just sort of following on in terms of routes to change. Is one person has just asked, Raja, I think, has asked, how do we make sure that the richest pay their fair share of tax in this situation, and what can we do to close tax loopholes, and how significant is the role of closing tax loopholes in the way to building back better?
So I think that closing tax loopholes is something that is essential. The best way to do it is to work internationally, which is the impacts, again, that Brexit might have are terrifying in terms of what it could mean of what the future of the UK looks like, in terms of potentially becoming that kind of tax haven for a playground of the rich in many ways. But there are different points of how we tackle the thing with wealth is, I sometimes think when we talk about wealth as if we've got a problem with wealth, and we don't. It's about who has that wealth and how it's distributed. And those who don't pay their fair share of tax are basically free riding off all of us. They're using our NHS for their workers, they're using our roads to transport their goods and services, they're using all of these systems that we've put in place through public money. If Amazon had paid its fair share of tax all of these years, I'm not going to say that we wouldn't be in the same place we are now, but you know what? They have massively benefited from what's been happening with coronavirus. I personally think there should be a wealth tax on that, because it's been as a result of people, of very people who have been harmed by sometimes their own policies, their own workers' policies that have been making sure that we keep going as a country, that has meant that they've been able to increase their profits to make their CEO potentially the first trillionaire in the world. Nobody should be a trillionaire. We need to be making sure that that wealth is about how we are wealthier as a country, as a planet, rather than an individual's wealth that is created off the backs of so many people. And even when you look at how Amazon has been taxed in the past, doing things like the government telling them how much they should be based on their expected earnings rather than just enabling them to report in the way they do, just shows how short-sighted and how there is not the political will from this government to tackle one of the biggest problems that we have in ensuring that that wealth is fairly distributed and the wealthiest pay, that these big corporations pay that fair share. Fair because it's the law. But their genuine fair share should be a proper wealth tax that makes sure that we are addressing inequality and ensuring that we are building ourselves up as a country. And I feel that anybody who doesn't understand the impacts of not investing in communities is just completely short-sighted. I speak to a lot of people who have more wealth. I think with the People's Assembly, we work quite closely with Charlotte Church, and people called her a hypocrite because she had all of this money, and she was saying that what we needed was to end austerity and invest in communities and people. And she's just like, I am not a hypocrite, because I want to pay my fair share. I want to be able to make sure that my community is protected, that people that I cross paths in the street, that their lives aren't harmed by a system that I'm complicit in. And I think that there's a lot that we can be doing to make sure, as a policy from the UK, but obviously internationally as well when it comes to tax loopholes, to have those principles at the heart of what we do. And I think there's so much that's tied into wealth and power and who's elected. We have a problem in the UK with, essentially because of our first past the post voting system, we always, and I'll just quickly say so, across Europe, we're the only country that doesn't have some form of proportional representation. I appreciate that France isn't very proportional, as with many countries, but some form of proportional representation other than the Vatican. And so, I mean, the fact that they announced their results with smoke is only the one step away from how antiquated our own system is. But while we're electing people who were like the people before, it means that we fail to put in any kind of diversity, whether that's diversity of gender, of race, of class. And it means that many people who have typically held those seats will continue, similar people will continue to hold those seats with very little scrutiny. I feel like it's a breath of fresh air to watch Caroline Lucas hold the government and hold the opposition to account. And what's been enabled as a result of that lack of political will is for many of the people who are in government, friends of the government, part of the same kind of social networks as the government, have benefited from a lot of government policy. And I think that shaking up our electoral system is a fundamental way to make sure that we have proper scrutiny in our parliament, which will tackle many of these issues of tax evasion, just effectively not sharing the wealth in the way that we so vitally need to.
Thank you so much, Amelia. There's so much there that you were speaking about that like resonates, and one of the questions that we've had come through is like when you're talking about like politics and like how things the odds are stacked against us. We've had quite a few questions about this in terms of how we can tactically have an impact as the Green Party and as a wider movement. One person has asked, like, how can we, the Greens and the UK society at large, resist a repeat of this inhumane, cruel austerity measures imposed on the poorer sections of our societies under the Tories, again, particularly with such a like a cabinet with such a big majority. And also, Martin has also asked in related, like, what should we do to combat cuts passed down to councils from the national government? What can we do at a grassroots level to push back?
So there's multiple things at play here. I'm going to begin by saying you'll remember that phrase that became really popular, the keep calm and carry on, and it got changed to like keep calm and drink tea and all kinds of like quirky different things. And it just frustrated me because I felt like there was so much happening at that time that I just felt like, you know, get angry and get organised. And we can achieve so much when we do that. And I think, I mean, just look what Young Greens have achieved the last few years with working to get more Young Greens elected and putting on these educational events. Getting organised can make a real big difference. And we have to admit that we talk about the Conservatives, but Labour have also been complicit in many of these issues around austerity. If you look at Oxford and Birmingham councils, they were looking to put in place fines for people who were sleeping rough. One of them was £50, one of them was £200. I can't remember which way round it was now, but it's irrelevant because these people are sleeping rough on our streets. It doesn't matter if it's £50 or £200. They shouldn't be charged for the fact that the government has failed to make sure that they're supported through a basic safety net in our social security. And so we need to be making sure that we have genuine scrutiny of our councils and of our political institutions. I would obviously say we need to get more Greens elected. Now, when we talk about getting Greens elected, I'd say that I'm a campaigner first and foremost, but I want to make a difference to communities, the environment, to make sure that we're fighting for rights, as so many people have done before us. But the reality is, unless we get people who reflect our views, more Greens elected, then we can win a campaign. But the only way we make sure it's institutionalised for genuine change is by getting Greens into council chambers and into the House of Commons and the House of Lords, as we've recently increased our numbers there. We can make a difference by speaking out. There has been a lot of people who, I think there's a lot of people who have experienced the worst effects of austerity, who have essentially been failed by government time and time again, but have remained silent. And voices have been oppressed. Effectively, we've seen voices oppressed. We need to amplify those voices and make sure that they're heard. But by speaking out, we can actually work to change a narrative of what's happening in our communities, using our press and newspapers to make sure that we are talking about the effects in our councils, on our communities. I'd say that there's a bigger challenge ahead after coronavirus. We've already seen our newspapers have effectively become, instead of being a newspaper where you used to have one that was typically supportive of the Conservatives and one that was typically supportive of Labour, scrutinising from different angles. We've seen those independent papers being bought out by the big media companies that own the majority of our press. A handful of people own the majority of our press, and there hasn't been genuine scrutiny. After coronavirus, if we lose those papers, and I think that we are going to lose another aspect of our scrutiny as well. So I think one thing that we need to provide a voice to is the power of independent press and journalism to make sure that we're holding our councils and our governments to account. Our own power about education, I think that you can make sure that we're going to events about this, amplifying the messages of different people, amplifying the messages of those affected by the failure of government policy, as we've seen with Black Lives Matter the last few weeks. The narrative has completely changed. There are conversations, powerful conversations that we've had in communities with friends on social media that have educated us all. putting things out on social media might just seem like a small act, but you never know the effect it can have. By doing things like using our power of protests, not at this time, but protests in general, but petitioning and lobbying and writing to your MP, these all do have an impact. Even an impact of education, assuming that your MP knows every single thing that's happening, every single impact, every single report, that needs to be put before them in many cases as well. And I think I often talk about how we can tip the balance. And sometimes you've got to remember that it only takes one grain of rice to tip the scales. And you could be that one grain of rice. You just don't know how your actions can change something, how it can tip the balance and make something change. So these things might seem like small things, but it's always been small things that have changed the course of history.
Oh, thanks. Here we go. Let's get out. Let's just stop the call now. Thank you so much, Amelia. I've got just time for, I think, a couple more questions, if that's okay. I'm sorry that we won't be able to ask all of them, but I just had a few questions have come in about narrative building, which I think is really important at this time to think about how we challenge some narratives that we've seen win before. And in particular, one person has highlighted the question around the fact that the Conservatives and the Lib Dems last time were able to blame Labour for the fact that they borrowed so much money that now we have to, during the crisis, force austerity and cuts. And the government again now is borrowing money and funding furlough schemes that are obvious and visible to many people. So we can imagine what story is going to come. So how do we answer the challenges about borrowing even more to invest in the country, and even if interest rates are low, etc. Yeah, I'll leave it at that one. Yeah, thanks.
It is an interesting one, because I think that the narrative has really changed, this idea that borrowing is bad, full stop. If you look at it, really takes away from what we're actually creating as a country. So if you invest in a hospital, it costs a lot of money up front. You're putting all of that money into the building itself, into everything in there. You're going to have to borrow potentially to be able to put those hospitals in place. But what that means for the long term is that you have a healthier society, that people have got their basic health needs met. And I think that when we talk about borrowing, it's seen as this kind of short-term bad thing, rather than about if you've got a clear vision about what we can be creating in the future. And I think that, again, it comes down to this idea that the way that we talk about borrowing in this country, I think it's so interesting that the government will talk about how borrowing is a bad thing for the government, but then we'll set young people out on their kind of first points of going to university and tell them that it's all right to rack up a lot of debt because we're investing in the future. And somehow these narratives can happen simultaneously without kind of any question that obviously, not that I'm saying that students should be loaded with debt. It should be the other way around, that we are talking about our government borrowing because it's an investment for the future. And I think that what's been happening with that narrative is just, again, as the beginning of the question highlighted, enabling a scapegoating of one group against another, enabling one rule applying to one person and not the next. So I think it's that vision of what we create and why that's important. And when it comes to the Green New Deal, I think that as one of the chats came up, as people become greener, people often say to me, what comes first? People, politics, business. I'd also put in there finance and press. The press are there. The press are talking about the green issues. The public are there. And talking about environmentalism like never before. Over 65% of people now want a job in a green industry. The finance sector, I did an interview during the last election at CNBC, which is like the big financial news services, and they were like, oh, I think the Green Party are the future. And I was thinking, you probably haven't seen our policies on taxing the richest in society, but but what they want is a genuine kind of green future, and they see green finance as that future. The people, business are there. Business are looking for an opportunity to make sure there's a level playing field when it comes to the environment, so that they're able to put greener greener policies in their own business in place, with some of the barriers to that removed. What's not there is our politicians right now, and I think if we are going to talk about that green vision, there's a lot more people behind it right now, and I hope that people will be able to buy into that vision alone, rather than continue to talk about borrowing and debt in the way that we have in the past.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was terrific. I have one question that Luann has asked, which I think would be great, and I'm going to take liberty in asking since we're the Young Greens. This question is, you mentioned the challenges that you faced when you were graduating during the time of the recession, and so Luann is asking, what difficulties do you anticipate for graduates and school leavers this summer, and specifically what would you like to be seen to help these people?
I'm going to begin with school leavers this summer because well, one of the things when they said that they were going to give people their predicted grades for their GCSEs and A-levels, we know that institutionalised racism means that typically for black boys, but for people of colour, that they often get often do so much better in their exams than they do with their predicted grades as a result of institutionalised racism. And I'm really concerned about the opportunities some of the opportunities that have been cut for so many people as a result of that policy being put in place. And I think that it's going to be tough the next few months and years. Interestingly, if less people go to university this September, which is a possibility, then it will mean that there are less jobs in academia, and it means that there are so many jobs actually hanging on the education sector. And who would want to, with the fees as they are at the moment. I know that I was incredibly lucky that although I've got student debt, I don't have it anywhere near to the amount of what people experience graduating just a few years after I did. So the challenges are going to be different for every person and every section of society, and I think that young people have just consistently been failed by politics. If there have been cuts, it's been young people that have experienced part of the brunt of those cuts. And when we saw after the last recession, it was housing benefit that was cut to the under 25s, which made an assumption that under 25s were able to move back to their family homes, as if that was something that people want to do after they've graduated when they're building a life for themselves, but also just isn't possible for so many people. And I think that it's also when we saw the increase in tuition fees, we've seen so many attacks on young people, even zero-hour contracts have harmed so many young people throughout this time. So I think it's potentially going to be really tough out there. I'm really sorry to say that. But the reality is that I think that there are so many incredible young people who are engaging in politics and having an opportunity to be part of kind of young Greens groups where we're able to, again, scrutinise, speak out and make sure that a youth perspective is heard is so vitally important. I think I've often been asked why our policies in the Green Party is so good for young people, and I think that the fact that it's been young people that have been part of the policy making process, where you can, any member is able to propose a policy and it's voted on the conference floor after it's been discussed, debated and finally voted on. And I think that there will be many points in the next few years where we need to be making sure that we are putting in place genuine policies about the future for young people. Post, after or living with coronavirus, possibly after whatever happens with Brexit. And again, get angry and get organised, because that's what changes things.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Yeah, I think that, like, just a cheeky plug, like one of the things that we've been thinking about for through these months is actually how much we really think that we have a really important role to play in this as the Young Greens, as the youth wing of one of the most radical political party at the moment, especially when Labour is moving to, Labour leadership is moving to the centre. We understand that like we're going to have a really, really important role to play in this. So if you are sat at home and a member of the Green Party who is under the age of 30 or a student, please do get involved. If you are not a member, why not join? If you are a member young at heart, but perhaps not in age, then please do support what we're doing through like any way that you can, whether it's social media or donating. But for members in particular in the Young Greens, we're really hoping to build up our infrastructure, our groups, our movement in these coming months. We've also got our annual convention coming up where we do shape the direction of the Young Greens going forward. You can submit policies, you can vote on them, so do look out for that. That will be in mid-August and it'll be online, so hopefully open and accessible to all. So we've got all that to come. I've got only time, I think, for one last question, Amelia, if that's okay. But I've had it from quite a few people, and it's a cheeky one, but I thought I'd still ask it. A lot of people are just dying to know what your plans are going forward, and in particular also the Welsh Assembly elections coming up that we know you're standing for, and what possibilities that holds.
Brilliant. I think I saw in the chat that somebody said about if you're being young and not being able to vote, and this next Welsh Parliament election, 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote. And I think, you know, I do think it's great as Greens that there is no lower age limit of how you can get involved. So I think that's really powerful as well. But great that the Welsh Assemblies, but they're proportional. 16 and 17-year-olds are going to be able to vote. It's a slightly different playing field than what we normally play on as Greens. I'm not going to say it's going to be an easy campaign, but it's an opportunity to really make history. And I feel like it's yet another thing where it's going to take hard work, but we're here, certainly I'm here and willing to put that work in. And I think often at these events, people are talking about the GPEX elections and our internal elections coming up. And all I'll say on that is we talk about diversity a lot as a party. And we know that if you are a woman, if you're a person of colour, if you're a person with a disability, if you're a person that doesn't always see themselves in the kind of roles that we have on the executive, it means that people will need the encouragement to stand. And I think it's really important. The stats on women is quite variable. Some people say you need to ask a woman 3 times before she even considers standing, and other people say far many more. So please do encourage people to stand. If you know somebody with a skill or specific talent in an area, there are many jobs that are going to be up for the GPEX elections. So please make sure you speak to people. Maybe it's not for them this time round, but we have elections every single year. So a chance to start thinking about how people can engage in our overall governance of the party. And please make sure that you are supporting people to run if you think that they'd be good at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amelia. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'm sorry we can't get through the questions, but can we have another Zoom round of applause? I don't know how it works, but yeah, it's just been brilliant to have you. We've had over 100 people on this call this evening, which is incredible, and we've had so many come and join us. But I think what we're doing here, even in the kind of the small rectangle of our makeshift living rooms or like studies or whatever we're now working in, these calls, these talks are really important for building up our education, building up our understanding of the challenges that we face in society. And so it's just so delightful to have you join us in helping us to think about these things. Before we do run away, I was going to ping over to Matthew, I think, who's going to again tell us more about what's coming up and share some links again so that you can join us at our next events.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks everyone for coming. It's been wonderful, and thanks most of all to Amelia for spending your Tuesday night with us. It's been fantastic. All that I have to say really is that you should all make sure you check out our calendar of events. We're updating it whenever we confirm a new event, and you'll find all of the latest on our website there. Our next event is with German Young Greens, as I described earlier, and that's co-hosted by a group from Munich and our very own London group as well. It's going to be fantastic, really exciting, the kind of thing that we've not had before in this series or like during my time with the Young Greens. So it's fantastic. Make sure you're there. and there's going to be a good sort of like participative, like taking part element as well. So that's just to sort of whet your appetite. I'm also going to stick the donation link in the chat as well. So if anyone is feeling particularly generous, particularly, you know, like there's a hole burning in their pockets, they can click the link there and go and donate. And finally, but by no means least, there is a link called a click to tweet. Now, how this works is if you follow the link next to the words click to tweet, what it will do is it will pre-write a tweet for you. And if you're on Twitter, then you'll be able to send that tweet for us. And what it'll do is tell all of your followers about how great this event has been and how great the next event has been as well. It'll also link your followers to our upcoming events, so they'll be able to sign up and join in the fun as well. So please do take a moment. It's really, really important. We reach loads of people this way. Please do take a moment to click on that click to tweet link and send that tweet for us. But otherwise, that's all from me. So I'll pass back to Rosie.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's it. Yeah, do all the click to tweeting, share the news. We'd love to have that, and it's been also so great to see so many new faces joining us. These events are open to all members, non-members, so please do come back. We'd love to have you, and it's so great to see all your faces. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. But cheerio and thanks, I guess.